In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro delves into several pressing issues currently shaping American politics and global affairs. He discusses the ongoing controversy surrounding ICE operations, the polarized American public opinion on immigration enforcement, and the recent disruptive anti-ICE protests, including one that took place inside a Minneapolis church. Beyond domestic matters, Shapiro explores geopolitical tensions involving Greenland, trade relations between Canada and China, and the evolving situation in Iran and Syria. Cultural and economic topics also arise, including the left's influence on media and education, debates over wealth taxation, and shifts in U.S. foreign and domestic policy under the Trump administration. Ben Shapiro opens by highlighting how Americans broadly support immigration enforcement in principle, especially when targeting criminal undocumented immigrants, but react negatively when enforcement actions become highly visible and confrontational on television. He reviews polling data from CBS News showing that 61% of Americans believe ICE is being overly tough in stopping and detaining people, with only 15% thinking they are not tough enough. The data reveals strong partisan divides regarding the anti-ICE protests. Nearly half of Democrats feel protesters haven't gone far enough, while fewer independents say the same. Crucially, public perception is shifting about who ICE prioritizes for deportation, with a growing majority believing non-criminal illegal immigrants are targeted rather than dangerous criminals. Approval for the Trump administration's immigration crackdown has fallen, with disapproval reaching 54%, including 60% disapproval among independents. While 50% of Americans support the goal of mass deportations, only 37% approve of how the policy is executed. The contested shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent has particularly damaged public perception, with 54% believing the shooting was unjustified. Overall, a majority of Americans favor decreasing ICE operations. Shapiro stresses that the issue is not opposition to law enforcement goals, but to the methods and optics of their implementation. Shapiro describes a chaotic incident in Minneapolis where anti-ICE protesters invaded a church service to protest a pastor allegedly linked to ICE. Videos show protesters chanting inside the sanctuary, disrupting worship, and provoking backlash from both law enforcement and religious leaders. While Don Lemon was present and appeared to sympathize with the protesters, the pastor condemned the interruption, emphasizing that the church was a place for worship, not protest. Shapiro underscores that such actions violate the spirit and letter of laws protecting religious worship, including the FACE Act, which criminalizes interference with houses of worship. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fryer suggested order would return once ICE left the city, indicating local tensions. Shapiro critiques the Democrats' tactics, predicting that church disruptions and violent protests will likely alienate the public, much as the unrest following George Floyd's death did in 2020. Referencing Harvard economist Roland Freer's work, Shapiro notes that restrained, nonviolent protest is more effective than chaotic confrontation. He insists that Trump's administration must focus on calm, predictable enforcement to politically outmaneuver disruptive left-wing activism. The episode touches upon inflammatory rhetoric from various political figures, including California Governor Gavin Newsom's claim that Trump is trying to stoke civil war by deploying federal agents in cities. Shapiro critiques such hyperbolic statements as unhelpful and divisive. Democratic strategist Meghan Hayes is mentioned for suggesting that Trump's heavy-handed immigration raids are part of a broader plan to militarize U.S. streets and evade democratic elections. Shapiro warns that while Democrats currently benefit from criticizing Trump's enforcement tactics, a push to abolish ICE entirely could backfire, given most Americans dislike the resulting public disorder. Virginia Governor Abigail Spanberger's rescinding of an executive order mandating local cooperation with ICE serves as an example of risky political maneuvering by Democrats. Celebrity voices like Bruce Springsteen demanding ICE's removal from Minneapolis underscore the cultural pressure on immigration enforcement, but may also deepen polarization. Shapiro emphasizes that the Trump administration's strongest immigration achievements are those quietly pursued and effectively enforced, such as closing the southern border, versus noisy, confrontational ICE raids. He advocates for calm, rule of law-based enforcement and criticizes the inconsistent messaging and harsh language surrounding incidents like the Renee Good shooting. The failure to moderate rhetoric has eroded public trust, as shown by plummeting confidence in federal investigations of such cases. He warns that overzealous or poorly managed ICE operations could politically weaken Republicans ahead of upcoming elections, while Democrats' disruptive resistance tactics risk similar damage if they alienate the average voter. Turning to the economy, Shapiro highlights a disconnect between strong macroeconomic indicators and widespread public pessimism. Recent polling shows more voters rate the economy as weak than strong, with negative views worsening since last summer. Trump's approval ratings also reflect this downturn, with his best numbers centered around border security, +6 net approval, and poorer numbers on immigration, -4, tariffs, 9-10, inflation, -7, and general economic strength, -10. Shapiro argues that Americans crave stability and want to be left alone rather than exposed to constant political chaos. He critiques Trump's aggressive tariff policies and distractions like the Greenland acquisition proposal, which he suggests confuse the public and risk economic disruption. Shapiro provides an overview of rising tensions between the U.S. and European NATO allies after Trump threatened 10% tariffs on imports from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and other countries over Greenland. The tariffs are a pressure tactic to force Denmark to negotiate the purchase of Greenland, a strategic Arctic territory important for U.S. military presence. European leaders have condemned the threat as damaging to transatlantic relations and warned it risks a dangerous downward spiral. NATO issued a statement reaffirming solidarity with Denmark and Greenland while emphasizing sovereignty and territorial integrity. Shapiro points out the inconsistency in Trump's approach, pushing NATO allies away economically while insisting on strong American control over Arctic security. Shapiro analyzes fallout from Trump's tariffs on Canada, arguing that these policies have pushed Canada closer to China economically. He references recent moves by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to ease trade tensions with China, including deals on electric vehicles, agriculture, and energy. These shifts represent a strategic recalibration away from reliance on the U.S. Shapiro expresses concern about Canada's growing ties with China, as such realignments undermine traditional Western alliances. He highlights comments from U.S. officials warning Canada it may regret edging toward Beijing and urges vigilance against further retreat from the American sphere. On the foreign policy front, Shapiro covers Trump's harsh criticism of Iran's leadership, urging regime change amid reports of thousands killed in violent crackdowns on nationwide protests. Despite the Iranian government's brutal repression and internet blackouts, Shapiro notes that protests have not ended but have been driven underground by security forces. He also discusses the Syrian conflict, specifically the Syrian government's recent military advances against Kurdish groups in northern Syria, supported by Turkey. Shapiro condemns Turkey's Islamist regime and criticizes its NATO membership, arguing that Erdogan's government is hostile to American and Western interests. The episode mentions Israeli opposition to a U.S.-formed Gaza Oversight Board, including Turkey and Qatar, the latter two seen as antagonistic toward Israel and supportive of Hamas, underscoring the complex and fraught nature of Middle East diplomacy. Shapiro critiques the left's cultural strategy of pushing ideology through movies, television, and education, resulting in media that lecture rather than entertain, and characters designed primarily to check diversity boxes. He warns similar efforts have infiltrated school curricula, shaping students with progressive viewpoints at the expense of neutral education. He references his own Daily Wire series, Real History with Matt Walsh, as a corrective that presents a version of American history unabashedly patriotic and free of anti-American bias. The podcast also critiques the casting of Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender performer, as Anne Boleyn in a Broadway musical about Henry VIII's wives, highlighting what Shapiro sees as historical revisionism and ideological overreach, disrupting artistic integrity. The conversation touches on Democratic calls, particularly in California, for a wealth tax targeting unrealized assets to penalize the wealthy. Shapiro argues this is economically damaging and unfair, explaining how it forces taxes on asset value increases even without sales. He rebukes claims that wealthy individuals owe taxes simply for having made money in certain states, suggesting such policies drive entrepreneurs and capital away. He criticizes prominent Democrats for their envy-driven rhetoric and warns of the growing embrace of socialism among segments of the public unfamiliar with its consequences. Shapiro notes that Republicans struggle to oppose socialist policies effectively, especially when some GOP members themselves support expansive government intervention and state-sponsored capitalism, undermining traditional free market conservatism. Lastly, Shapiro explores the broader foreign policy direction under Trump. He questions whether the administration pursues a hawkish realist approach, asserting America's interests aggressively worldwide, or is signaling a retrenchment by consolidating control in select areas like Greenland and Venezuela while retreating elsewhere. Shapiro notes global powers are recalibrating in response, with rising Chinese influence in South America and shifts in alliances. Domestically, Democrats remain confident about taking control of Congress, promising to restore and increase spending cuts rolled back under the Trump administration and openly proposing wealth taxation. Shapiro argues this intensifies the ideological battle over America's political future, setting the stage for major conflicts over spending, governance, and national identity.